Welcome to episode 1 of the Roman Britain podcast. If you are just joining us, this podcast is about the invasion, settlement, and eventual integration of the area that we now currently call England and Wales, and at parts and at times southern Scotland, into the Roman Empire. The causes, the effects, how Britons saw themselves, how they spread out amongst the known imperial world, how Latin became a part of the language, if not completely, and how the Britons affected Rome. All of this said, please stay with us. And now for the intro. Welcome to episode 1. This episode is entitled Dum Spero. Salvete, and welcome to the Roman Britain podcast. Today we are looking at Britain in the 1st century BCE, before Julius Caesar's first invasion in 55 BCE. This was not an isolated island, but one already shaped by complex societies, long-distance trade, and remarkable craftsmanship. Archaeology allows us to move past myths to see how Britons lived, what they valued, and how they were tied to the wider world. It opens up an eye to a people that did not have, or at least we don't know of, literacy, that seemingly were dark to us before archaeology came along and gave us a window into their souls. Over 10 episodes, we explored the Iron Age in Britain, how the arrival of Celtic culture reshaped much of what had come before. It is tempting to think of the period as a monolith, as the mysterious other where people settled, bore children, fought, worshipped, and died in silence. But of course, this is an exaggeration. Written history may largely be silent of the area, but archaeology and material culture reveal that Iron Age Britain was not mute in any way, shape, or form. It is, of course, Julius Caesar who gives us our most detailed early descriptions of the place. He later wrote that the Britons were divided in numerous tribes, each led by their own chieftain, and this comes from the commentary on the Gallic Wars, which is his own work. One could say the most biased and yet best opportunities we have to get a peek at that period's version of culture, especially in Gallic areas of France and Belgium, where much of the fighting of this war took place, and it gives us an understanding of how those cultures interacted with the Romans to a degree, if, again, through the lens of Caesar and through his understanding of what these people were. Archaeology, of course, supports this image of a mosaic of communities. Hill forts such as Maiden Castle, Dorset, and Danbury in Hampshire dominated landscapes for centuries, and thousands more dominated the hills of Wales and England. By the 1st century BCE, their role, which had been a part of the landscape for hundreds of years, was starting to shift. Excavations at Maiden Castle show that fortifications were expanded around 100 BCE, but later activity suggests that the site had become as much ceremonial and political rather than a defensive fortification. It is easy to imagine the Britons on this island awaiting Rome, awaiting for a chance to tell their story, to be perceived at last in our histories. But evidence tells us, of course, that there was a rich history here, that there was a story to tell amongst the people that lived there. It may not be as complete as we would like. It may not include the names we would like. It may not even give us an in-depth understanding of the people, but it does give us an understanding of them nonetheless. Britain was already a land of vibrant communities, complex identities, and deep connections with continental Europe that went for hundreds of years, and some could argue thousands of years, before Caesar ever even saw the English Channel. Everyday life in this period was rooted around the farmstead and the hill fort. At Danebury and South Cadbury, archaeologists found roundhouses, storage pits, and craft areas, the remains of a society sustained by farming, animal husbandry, and skilled labor. Across the countryside, families lived in timber-framed roundhouses with thatched roofs. Excavations at Little Woodbury in Wiltshire revealed loom weights for weaving, large storage pits, and animal bones, evidence of the importance of sheep and cattle to the life of these people. These settlements were modest but organized, marked by pride in craft and community. Hill forts, of course, were not simply fortresses, as we said, but by this period were often functioning as political ceremonial centers. Much like, if you think about it, the way medieval castles and palaces become more about presentation eventually. They become more about, especially after the Renaissance and the developments of cannons and things of that nature, you have, instead of massive fortifications, they actually become centers of ritual and of ostentatious examples of wealth that would help lords and especially monarchs show their ability to reign over their subjects. These are the kind of things that you could probably expect at this point, whereas very similar in hill forts. Was it the same? No, obviously not. But you would see this idea of ostentation, of probably a lot of colors involved, of support and strength through numbers and through weapons, and of course, through large efforts at ceremony. For example, at Danbury, huge pits were filled with animal remains and broken pots, suggesting large communal feasts where elites were reinforcing their authority through hospitality and display, something that's very important, especially in these eras when you have tribal leaderships and maybe small kingdoms. You're going to have a lot more need to show your ability to feed and to, again, show that obvious wealth that comes with leadership. And of course, if you were to think about it from the idea of someone living in this era, let's start with a picture of a family in 60 BCE. At dawn, the farmer, of course, checks his cattle. His wife spins wool on the drop spindle. And to be fair, we're not entirely sure that that was always the case. Maybe it was the other way around. We don't fully know. There's lots of suggestions about whether women were in leadership positions, if they were military leaders. We don't know enough to be able to say, but it just is an example here. Children, of course, trudge to the stream with clay jars and get their feet muddy on the path as they trudge back and forth and into the area where these were needed. And inside, the hearth smokes would blend with the smell of grain bread and salted pork. And life was modest, but far from poor. Decorated pottery and finely made tools showed care and craftsmanship and acted as symbols of community pride. You can imagine these were symbols of a person's ability to do certain things. So it would have within it its own measure of wealth, if you want to call it that. Think of how we act and how we live today. Most people have a television. Most people have a computer, especially in the Western world. Most people have iPads and tablets and phones, all of these symbols of the modern world. And they would be no different then. They'd want the symbol of the world, to use a phrase, keeping up with the Joneses or the Smiths, depending on who you're in, what area you're in. And all of that would probably come about. People would be like, well, did you see that guy? He has a really nice plow. Maybe we should get a plow like that. Maybe we should find out how he built a plow like that. All of these things would be important, and would have aspects and ways of making people want to continue to have more and more, even if it's humble by our understanding of it. And of course, these households were not isolated. Britain was, and as it is today, had a far-reaching trade network, even amongst themselves, but also to the wider world. Mediterranean wine transported in Dressel amphorae. Amphorae, if you're unfamiliar, is a large vessel, looks like a large vase or vase. It has a stopper on the top, and within it is wine. They've been found all over the place, in places like Pompeii, in vessels that have sunk from that period. And in some cases, the wine is still good. Well, I wouldn't say good, but it's still in them. And they were sort of the, you know, crate of the ancient world. That was how you transported liquids. It was how you got olive oil and all sorts of other things to reach large distances without going missing or getting easily broken or all the other things about it. And you can contain high degrees of them. So the fact that these reached southern Britain as early as the 2nd century BCE shows that there was a lot of people willing to trade them. And often these trades came through Gaulish middlemen. In return, of course, Britain exported tin from Cornwall, lead and silver from the Mendips, woolen textiles, grains, and perhaps even slaves. Caesar himself later remarked that British hunting dogs were prized in Gaul. These imports and exports were not mere luxuries, they were political tools. They were used to be, again, consumed at feasts to impress allies, and of course your own people, to secure loyalty amongst everyone. Britain at this stage does not grow wine. It doesn't have olive oil, or olives even for that matter. So you have these fancy goods that you can bring out and show off just your ability to command, that you can collect all this stuff. You have the wherewithal and the resources, and how we would think about it, the money, but they didn't have money in the way we think of it back then, but the ability to trade at such a high level that you're able to bring in these luxury goods to brag with. Now, as an example of this is Hengistbury Head on the Dorset coast, which in the early part of the 1st century became, and I should say the 1st century BCE, became the central port of trade for the British Isles to Armorica and Lower Normandy. Archaeologists have uncovered this late Iron Age port, and because of it, they found amphorae, imported pottery, and other goods that showed the flow of Mediterranean product into British hands. In Kent, Essex, and Sussex, Gallo-Belgic pottery began to appear in abundance, clear evidence that these had continental connections. And as Professor Barry Cunliffe observed, the late Iron Age saw the emergence of a new elite, whose power was increasingly expressed through the access to continental trade and conspicuous consumption of imported wine and other luxuries. Of course, not only did we have these luxury items and these luxury political figures, we also had an age of flourishing craftsmanship. At Snetisham Hoard in Norfolk, over 150 torques and ornaments, some gold, date to around 75 to 25 BCE. We mentioned them a little bit when we did ancient Wales, but I want to bring them up here. These, of course, were not trinkets, but were symbols of status, usually worn by elites as a visible statement of wealth and power. Only a very few people could afford to have gold or other bright, brilliant metals like silver and copper and bronze. And so it set them apart. It put them at a status level that you can go to the point of actually burying people with. It shows that, because you don't usually bury useful tools. It's usually signs of attachment or signs of luxury or wealth, if you want to describe it that, or in some cases, signs of what is meaningful to the society. Weapons, of course, also carried meaning. Iron swords and ornate scabbards, decorated shields were also found in rivers such as the Thames, and these were both practical tools, but also could be ritual offerings. This was something you would note, especially with broken or bent swords. These were often the things that got thrown into the river. It wasn't, or lakes. It wasn't, the fully functional sword that you still need. It's usually something that's already worn down or worn out, because that's an easy gift to the gods. The gods can sort it out. They can make it work. Now, of course, we've mentioned all of these symbols of power, but perhaps the most striking sign of British integration into the wider networks of Europe was coinage. We don't often think about this, but in reality, the first British coins actually appear in the 2nd century BCE, between 150 to 100 BCE specifically, which directly imitated not Roman coins, but Gaulish coins. By Caesar's day, the tribes like the Catalavani, the Trinovantes, and the Atrebetes were mining their own, and often stamped them with the names of their own leaders. Archaeologist Colin Hazelgrove noted coinage in Britain, as in Gaul, was less a medium of everyday exchange than a vehicle for the expression of power and identity. Belgic tribes, of course, the ones who began this process for most of these Celtic tribes in Gaul, had the ability to use their access to gold to mint these coins in northern Gaul. They presented them to the tribes in southern Britain, likely as part of an exchange, possibly, as suggested by Caesar, to create political linkages. He will in fact contest later that Britons made up at least some of the ranks of the Belgic armies arrayed against Caesar, in part because of these political linkages. How much of that is truth? Couldn't tell you, rather than justification for why he went into Britain in the first place. We don't really know, of course. Evidence is not strong one way or the other, but it is something to keep in mind. It has been suggested that this may have been because the Belgic kings were perceived by some British tribes to be their high king or battle leader, something of a bit of a phrase we toss around a bit in both the pre-Roman period and especially in the post-Roman period, where the idea of a high king becomes incredibly overwrought and much discussed amongst what we would call the post-Roman era writers and some of the historians. But this is something that's been suggested, which, if you have tribes, specifically of Belgic peoples that are moving from the areas of Gaul that they lived in into Britain and settling in there for whatever reason, this then makes sense that they would also have loyalty to an overlord back in the old country, if you want to put it that way. Therefore, these coins were not merely pocket change, they were political statements, broadcasting the authority of chiefs and marking their participation in shared European culture and prestige. It also created links among various nobility, possibly with obligations, as we mentioned. Of course, with all this, as we mentioned, trade, of course, was accompanied by migration. Pottery styles, burial traditions show that people as well as goods crossed the channel. Caesar wrote that many coastal tribes were, quote, recent immigrants from Gaul, end quote. While Roman authors often exaggerated differences, evidence does suggest that there were close linkages between Gaul and Britain. We just mentioned one of them. And we know that people could cross the channel. Trade was happening all the time. It would make sense that people would move back and forth. People would intermarry with local tribes, and maybe enough of them moved over that this tribe began to identify itself more as a Belgic tribe than a British tribe. Or conversely, maybe there was enough of the leadership that were Belgic, then enough people took on the language and the practices and the dress of their Belgic neighbors that they basically became perceived as being Belgic by the time Caesar arrives, even though most of the people are still British. Of course, another aspect of all this that we need to talk about in this period just before is the treatment of the dead, because that also shows diversity and continental influence. In East Yorkshire, for example, the Eris culture produced striking chariot burials, some of which we mentioned previously. At Wetwang Slack, individuals were interred in two-wheeled chariots, weapons, and feasting gear were also buried with them, echoing aristocratic traditions in Gaul. These burials proclaimed elite identity within a pan-European warrior class. In the south, cremation dominated. At Aylesford and Welwyn, cremated remains were placed in urns alongside amphorae and bronze vessels, again showing the massive amounts of trade that were happening. And these graves were not simply interments, but statements of status and linking the dead to the continental traditions that were starting to affect Iron Age Britain. As Miranda Aldhouse Green writes, quote, "The disposition of prestige objects in rivers and bogs was part of the pan-European pattern of votive behavior, a dialogue with the supernatural world as much as with the living community." End quote. Elsewhere, particularly in western and northern Britain, burials were more modest, but even here, occasionally decorated pottery or metalwork reminds us that memory and identity mattered deeply to this population, and that they didn't go away just because they weren't buried necessarily with fancier items. Of course, all of this shows a religious movement and a ritual movement. These offerings in the bogs are the glimpses of the beliefs of the people. Swords and shields deliberately broken and cast into the Thames were sacrifices to power beyond the human world. These practices mirror those in Gaul, where sanctuaries like Gournay-sur-Aronde also saw weapons and wealth dedicated to the gods. And perhaps most important is the conclusion that Britain and Gaul were inseparably linked. Caesar himself said the two peoples shared language, religion, and customs. Archaeology, of course, confirms that. Coinage, motifs on torques and scabbards, burial traditions, and pottery all revealed a shared cultural experience. As Barry Cunliffe has put it, quote, "To view the Channel as a barrier between Britain and Gaul is a distortion. In reality, it was a corridor along which people, goods, and ideas flowed continuously." End quote. So when Caesar finally arrives, he did not encounter an untouched island, a pure, pagan, innocent people, if you want to put it that way. He found a land that was already bound into a network of Iron Age Europe. It was rife with elites who wielded power through trade and display, and communities whose rhythm of life connected them both to ancestors and continental kin. So, if we were once again to describe a picture of this, think about what your life might have been in Iron Age Britain on this edge of this massive change. Your tribe whispers of newcomers across the ocean, people who brought new styles, new goods, and, of course, strange tales. They trade glass beads for wool and tin, but behind the stories lie fear. They say they were driven from their own lands by a people called the Romanus, heavily armored, relentless, and conquering. You shake your head, grateful that the narrow sea that seems to shield you from them, but already their presence hints that the isolation is actually an illusion. When Julius Caesar first invaded Britain in 55 and then again in 54 BCE, he noted that coastal tribes were recent immigrants from Gaul, as we mentioned. He did not give us an exhausted tribal list, but his description, combined with the archaeology and later sources, allow us to identify some of the key groups active in the late Iron Age. And so we're going to go through 3 different sources of writings that we have, the names that we associate with them, which are largely Roman names, so we have no idea how loyal they are to the actual names that the people themselves spoke. I would put it very similar to the way North American native tribes and tribes across the world, when interacting with the modern world, how often their naming conventions and things got mangled by the people that arrived. For example, the idea of Canada being a place that covered a large, vast area, when in actuality, Kanata covered a very small region and a very tiny area. There were a lot of these examples of things where, and in some cases, the names were completely messed up because pronunciation changed things. I can look at that on maps of the 1600s when they're going through Wales and you have English cartographers describing the names of places. And one of the obvious examples I know, because my ancestry and relatives, honestly, still live there, is Rhyw, which is spelt in Welsh Rhiw, but on this map is spelt the way it sounds, Rue. That's kind of how these mistakes happen. So, with all that in mind, let's give it the benefit of the doubt and we'll go through a bunch of the names. I realize it's going to be a lot of names. I realize you won't remember them all. It's okay. You don't have to remember them all. It's more about just getting them out there so you know who's there, or as much as we can know. So let's start off from the south. The Cantaaki, better known to us today as the area around Kent, occupied the southeastern corner of Britain, obviously around Kent. Caesar, of course, mentions the Cantonum region as the most civilized and closely tied to Gaul, probably the ones who are practicing the most similar to Roman ideals about what the, in quotes, barbarians are doing. Archaeology at Aylesford and Hengistbury show the continental imports were in abundance here, in part because this was the trade network coming through that area. The Trinovantes were in the Essex region. They were powerful in Caesar's day, and they were rivals of the Catuvellauni. By 54 BCE, Caesar allied with them against their rival, and the chieftain who led them, known as Cassivellaunus. Their center was likely around Colchester, or in Roman times, better known as Camulodunum. Catuvellani, based around Herefordshire and Buckinghamshire, was a dominant tribe that had expanded westward and southward. Their leader, Cassivellaunus, one we mentioned before, resisted Caesar's second invasion. Later, they became one of the most powerful and influential tribes in southern Britain during the early stages of the invasions later. The Atrebates were based in Hampshire, Berkshire, and Surrey. They were a branch of a Gaulish tribe, apparently, and they settled in southern Britain. Their leader, Commius, originally Caesar's ally in Gaul, became a major player in Britain after fleeing Roman control. The Iceni, a name we will bring up quite frequently, were not explicitly mentioned by Caesar, but archaeology suggests their presence in East Anglia. They later, of course, become famous because of Tacitus's account of Boudicca's revolt, the leader of the Iceni around 60 CE. Albeni, around Gloucestershire and Avon, again, not named by Caesar, but visible by their distinctive coinage in the 1st century BCE. Next on the list is the Regni, or the Regnesses, in the Sussex area, possibly emerging later, but their territory in Sussex shows early continental connections, which makes you wonder if maybe they were one of these groups that fled Gaul and moved into this area of Britain. Maybe it was partially settled, maybe it was very sparsely settled. It's hard to know. The populations in the Iron Age Britain were fluctuating quite a lot and were not large by what we would think of in modern contexts. In fact, Caesar also describes that the Castellanus confederation of tribes collectively resisted him, indicating that alliances at least were temporary and situational rather than permanent states. Now we move into Tacitus in the 1st century CE. So you're going to have some names which are further afield because Tacitus is writing in an era where they'd already conquered Roman Britain, and a lot more of these names are known. So along with the ones that we already have, as mentioned, we have the Iceni. Won't go into that again, but they become important players in that period. The Brigantes in northern England, which were the largest tribe in Britain, covering much of modern Yorkshire and Lancashire. And Queen Cartimandua, their pro-Roman leader, played a decisive role in early Roman politics and is perceived to either be a traitor to her people or a preservating force for her people. The Silures from South Wales, a name we brought up in the past on the Welsh History Podcast. They are described by Tacitus as fierce. They resist the Roman occupation for a long time, in part because their mountainous lands made conquest difficult. Surprise, surprise, Wales is hard to conquer because of the hills and mountains. The Ordovice from North Wales. Now, I'm going to be clear. Some of these places and names and locations are all over the map. Sometimes they get muddled, especially when it comes to the Welsh tribes, but we're going to go with what we have. Also, were noted for their resistance. They become a part of the battles that Paulinus will fight, and Agricola's campaign against him around 77 CE is one that Tacitus records. There's also the Dementi of West Wales, who occupy modern Pembrokeshire and Carmarthenshire, known more from around the Ptolemy later map, but their settlement patterns suggest relative stability, so it's assumed they were there long before that. So now we come to our third source, even farther in the future, which is Ptolemy's geography from the 2nd century CE, and of course we're looking back now at who these tribes may or may not have been. Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia provides the fullest list of tribes, of course, many of which surely existed before during Caesar's day, but are only recorded later because Caesar never got that far. Some of the key names include the Belgae from Hampshire, a tribe with clear links to the Gaulish counterparts, again suggested by Caesar as being possible settlers that had arrived in recent times. The Daemoni of Cornwall and Devon, who occupy the southwest peninsula. Their tin resources had long been traded to the continent even before Caesar's day. The Cornovae from Shropshire and Cheshire occupy the Midlands, later forming part of the Roman military recruitment. The Parisii from East Yorkshire, their name of course echoes, surprise, surprise, a Gaulish tribe. Paris coming from that particular tribe specifically, and are behind the spectacular chariot burials such as those at Arras. So why do these tribes matter? Why are these names important and not just labels? To us, I think as historians will say, as archaeology will say, as people will say, this shows us the identity of the Britons. They're not just British, but are members of a kinship-based political tie related to land and lineage. Their coinage, their hill forts, their hoards all reinforce these identities. It all reinforces who they were and what they were. For example, the Trinovantes stamped their leaders' names like Ade Dominarus on coins around 20 to 10 BCE. Iceni minted stylized horse coins in East Anglia from the 1st century BCE. The Parisii buried their elites with chariots, connecting them to the continental tradition of the same move. But by the time Caesar looked around the channel in 55 BCE, Britain was no wilderness. It was an island of farming communities. We have to get it out of our heads, this idea that when we think tribal, there's often this idea that they're like roaming around. Well, that probably has long since stopped. Most of Britain at this stage is being farmed and fished, and there's ranching going on after a fashion, so husbandry of animals. Yes, there's wild areas. Yes, there's probably people that live in them and that move back and forth. But for the majority, it's settlement, not living off the land as much. And of course, all of this means that these elites and these farmers traded their product. Caesar himself noted, quote, "The interior of Britain is inhabited by those who, according to tradition, are aboriginal people," end quote, while the coastal tribes that had recently migrated from Gaul are the civilized ones. Make of that what you will. Britain was already connected, already changing, and poised on the edge of even greater transformation. Of course, this is just the beginning, and we are about to enter a much broader and much more dramatic world as we go forward. things are about to change for our lovely Iron Age Celtic Britons, and their world will never be the same because of it. With all of that, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on various social media at Welsh History Pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And as always, if you'd like to help with these projects, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all for viewing or listening today. Certainly appreciated, and I hope you enjoy this series. I'm quite excited about it. I think it's going to be a wonderful exploration of so much of what we understand about Britain and how the Roman version was founded, what drove it, and how that changed the British as a whole, from the top of Scotland down to the bottom of England and into the west of Wales and to the east of the Anglican areas. How would all of this change, grow, and become much different than the one that entered it? Thank you all. Once again, have a wonderful day. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.